So looking at the home front and how did this impact women? For many women, black and white, intervention in World War I also generated some dramatic changes. Initially, women supported the war effort in mostly traditional ways. They organized fundraising drives, they conserved food and other war-related materials. They supported the Red Cross. They joined the Army Nurse Corps, excuse me. But as the scope of the war widened, the government and industry started to recruit women to work on the farms, loading docks, railway crews, as well as in the armaments industry, machine shops, steel and lumber mills, and chemical plants. And a lot of these women saw this opportunity as a breakthrough. At last, after centuries of disabilities and discrimination, women are starting to come into the labor force and festival of life on equal terms with men. That's what they had hoped for. In reality, though, these war-generated changes in female employment were limited and they were brief. About 1 million women participated in war work, but most of them were young and single and already working outside the home. Most returned to their previous jobs once the war ended, and in fact, a lot of these male-dominated unions encouraged women to revert back to their stereotypical domestic roles after the war ended. They actually, in some cases, insisted that the same patriotism that introduced women to enter industry during the war should induce them to vacate their positions after the war. And in fact, in 1920, just 2 years after the war, the percentage of women working or making up the labor force was actually smaller than it was in 1910. However, one of the positive outcomes that came from the women working or participating in the war effort is that it allowed Wilson it encouraged Wilson to go ahead and make the decision to endorse women's suffrage. In the fall of 1918, he told the Senate that giving the women the vote was vital to winning the war. And we will see the 19th Amendment finally ratified in 1920, granting universal women's suffrage in all 50 states. All right, so what did the United States do in Europe? How did they contribute to the war effort in Europe? So we're going to look at the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF in Europe, led by General John J. Pershing. Same General Pershing that led the Pancho Villa raids in Mexico. These nicknames that you might hear the AEF called, Doughboys would be one. And we want to look at how, the fighting in France, getting over there, and then looking at what specific battles did Americans play a major role. So American troops, they played more, just a little more than a token role in the European fighting until early 1918. It took them a while to train the troops and transport the troops over to Europe to get them and get them integrated into the European lines to actually take part in the fighting. All through 1917, looking at what was happening in Europe as far as what, the fighting goes, all through 1917, the Allied armies were remaining on the defensive, and later in that year, their situation started to turn desperate. By October of 1917, the Italian lines had collapsed and were overrun by Austrian forces. The Italians finally, they were able to hold the ground eventually with some of the help of the French. But then, the situation that was happening in Russia are going to make things even more complicated. In November of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Russian Republic, and communist leaders dropped out of the war. So with the Central Powers victorious over Russia, they were now free to concentrate their forces on the Western Front. This is going to include the, bringing the United States, because the American war effort thus became a race for the defense of France. The French premier is quoted as Clemenceau is quoted as saying, to the Americans that they have to accelerate the mobilization. A terrible blow is imminent. He said, "Tell your Americans to come quickly." Clemenceau is predicting that the Germans are going to launch an offensive in the spring of 1918, with Russia pulling out in late November, December of 1917. He knows that a big push by the Germans are going to come in the spring of 1918, and that the Americans must get over there, or the war is going to be a lost cause. And Germany is going to have won the war before the American presence is even felt. And so in March of 1918, Clemenceau's prediction came true, and Germany is going to begin the first of several spring offensives in France and Belgium to try to get the war over before the Americans arrive. By May of 1918, there were 1 million fresh but untested and undertrained U.S. troops in Europe. And for the first time, they start to make a difference. And so during the week of June of 1918, we see American Marines block a German offensive at Belleau Wood. And Army troops oppose the Germans at Chateau Thierry. Although these are relatively modest actions and had limited military significance, the effect on Allied morale was significant. And even though the British and the French armies continue to bear the brunt of the fighting, we do see that now the United States and the AEF is starting to be able to make a difference, as far as making a difference as far as, changing the course of the war in favor of the Allies. There's a momentum shift now, since the United States has made it to Europe. The big turning point comes in July of 1918 at the Second Battle of the Marne. The Marne River is located just outside of Paris. And the First Battle of the Marne is when the French and British armies are able to stop the Germans from invading Paris, and thus end the effectiveness of the Schlieffen Plan and turn World War I into a stalemate. The Second Battle of the Marne is going to be when the British, the French, and Americans stop the German advance once again and start to push the Germans back into Belgium. We then see, after the Second Battle of the Marne, we then see the United States AEF start to take the offensive and see a little bit more action in some of these events. For instance, in September of 1918, probably the peak of the United States fighting in the European theater happens when you see a big offensive in the Meuse-Argonne Forest begins with American divisions joined up with British and French divisions in a drive towards breaking off a railroad that supplied the entire German fleet, or to supply the entire German front with supplies in France. This is going to be the largest American action of the war, involved 1.2 million U.S. troops, and resulted in over 100,000 American casualties, including 26,000 dead. And so, once again, Chateau Thierry, Second Battle of the Marne, American troops are there to resupply Allied troops to help stop the German advance. Belleau Wood, and then arguably the most important one, the Meuse-Argonne, are offensives in which Americans see, or a lot of Americans see action and play a huge role in being able to push the Germans back into Belgium and starting to make turn the war back over to the Allies. And so at this time, as we get into the fall of 1918, it becomes apparent that the conflict in Europe is starting to end. But neither side, the problem is that neither side had stated openly what they hoped to gain from this fighting. They both knew that it was going to end, but what do you want from it? And this is when Wilson's going to start to repeat a lot of these 14 points that he had outlined to start to push for that idea of peace or that victory. Wilson repeated that the Americans themselves had no selfish war aims. He's quoted as saying, "We desire no conquest, no dominion." This was in April of 1917 in his war message. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. Once again, Wilson loves to use that flowery language that kind of shows off his idealism and his plans for that post-war world. And Wilson believed that the United States really, once again, they're on that special mission. They're on that crusade to lead the world out of this conflict and out of this chaos. He said that people everywhere are looking to us for direction and leadership. And unfortunately for him, even though he's hatched out that plan, those 14 points, the British and the French had promised territorial gains to Italy, Romania, Greece, to get them on their side. So what Wilson is saying, what's going to happen as a result of the peace, and what promises have already been made, they don't jive with each other, and that's going to become difficult when the Big Four get together in Paris to try to hammer out the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. One thing that we want to look at is that Wilson had been hatching out his plan to restructure post-war Europe and to remake the world in the American image. And this is where his 14 points come into play. The 14 points, he says, is the only possible program for peace. The first 5 points call for diplomacy to be conducted openly rather than in these hidden treaties that help cause some of this mess in the first place. Most of the remaining points dealt with territorial claims. Once again, redrawn the map with the idea or the concept of self-determination at hand. Point number 13 called for the creation of an independent nation for the Poles. So Poland is going to be created. And the most important of the 14 points will be the last one. Point number 14 called for the creation of a League of Nations. And then the purpose of this League of Nations was to protect global peace. I believe I made this mention. I made mention of this in earlier videos that this is going to be where the international community can get together and can air out grievances and that can hammer out problems without having to result to go to war. This is going to be, and all of them really embodied Wilson's sincerest ideals. In fact, it was so convincing that in October of 1918, the German Chancellor called for an end to the fighting on the basis of Wilson's 14 points. The Allies accepted the 14 points as the basis of negotiations, but with two significant reservations. The British insisted on the right to discuss limiting the freedom of the seas, and the French demanded reparations from Germany and Austria for war damages. And so this, once again, this is going to be something important to remember, is that the reason why the Germans are going to eventually agree to a ceasefire or agree to Armistice Day on November 11th, 1918 is because they're assuming that the peace treaty is going to be written on the basis of Wilson's 14 points, on the basis of the idea of peace without victory. However, going into that Paris Peace Conference, Great Britain and France have other plans. And so this is going to be something that is going to be a continued problem into the summer of 1919. And it's going to be something that's going to help people like Adolf Hitler, rouse up support in the 1920s, really playing on the fact that the Treaty of Versailles was a betrayal of what the Germans had been told in the days and weeks leading up to the Armistice Day. Now, speaking of the Armistice Day, the official ceasefire of World War I will come on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. All right, and on November 11th, 1918, the guns of Europe are going to fall silent. After 1,500 days of warfare, actually 1,563 days to be exact, the guns fall silent. And under the Armistice Agreement, the Germans had agreed to evacuate occupied territories and pull their troops behind the Rhine River. And the Germans were assured once again that Woodrow Wilson's 14 points would be the basis for the peace conference. Now, in the next video, we will look at what actually happens, and we will look at the opposition home and what this means for Woodrow Wilson, what does this mean for the Democrats, and what does this mean for the international community.